felt the rough hemp rope tighten around my neck as rain soaked through my thin dress. The crowd had gathered to watch me die. Me, a simple peasant girl accused of stealing the sacred chalice. The executioner's hand rested on the lever that would drop me to my death. In that moment, I thought of my little brother Thomas, who would be left alone in the world, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. That's when I heard it, the thunderous approach of hooves against stone. The crowd parted like a human sea as King Frederick himself rode into the square. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and something passed between us that I couldn't explain. With just 4 words, "She will not die today," he changed everything. I had no idea why the king would save someone like me, or why I woke the next morning in a castle bed with dried blood on my clothes that wasn't mine. What I discovered in the days that followed would shake the kingdom to its foundations. A royal conspiracy spanning decades, a hidden letter about a child of royal blood, a king's forbidden love, and the terrifying truth about who I really am. A truth that some would kill to keep buried forever. The rain fell mercilessly upon the cobblestone square, each drop like a tiny hammer striking the ancient stones of Westmere. Under this deluge, a young woman with wild matted hair was being dragged forward by 2 royal guards. Her hands, caked with soil from the fields she had tended since childhood, were bound tightly with coarse rope that cut into her wrists. Her name was Eloise, and today she was to die. "Move, thief!" one guard spat, shoving her forward as she stumbled in the mud. The crowd had already gathered despite the downpour, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and cold indifference. Such was the fate of peasants who dared to transgress against the crown. The accusation hung in the air as heavily as the storm clouds above. Eloise had allegedly stolen the sacred chalice from the royal altar, an act considered not merely theft, but blasphemy of the highest order. The evidence against her was circumstantial at best, but when one was born to till the soil, truth often held less weight than convenience. The execution bell began to toll, its deep, resonant sound echoing across the square and up to the castle balconies where silk-clad nobles watched the proceedings with detached interest. Among them stood clergy members whose faces betrayed no mercy, only a cold satisfaction that justice, their version of it, would soon be served. Eloise. A child's voice pierced through the murmurs of the crowd. A small boy, no more than 8 years old, pushed his way to the front, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. "Sister! Sister!" he cried, reaching out with one tiny hand before being roughly pushed back by a guard. "Stay back, boy," the guard warned, "unless you wish to join her." Eloise felt her heart splinter at the sight of her brother. Thomas was all she had left in this world. Who would care for him when she was gone? Who would make sure he ate when there was hardly enough food? Who would tell him stories by candlelight during the bitter winter nights? These thoughts tormented her more than the prospect of her own death. "Please," she pleaded, her voice barely audible above the rain, "let me speak to my brother one last time." Her request fell on deaf ears. No one stepped forward to defend a field worker against the word of the royal clerics. Not even the village elder, who knew her family for generations, dared to speak. Fear had sewn their lips shut more effectively than any thread could. The executioner, a mountain of a man whose face remained perpetually hidden behind a black hood, waited silently on the wooden platform. The noose hung ready, swaying slightly in the wind. Eloise was forced up the slippery steps, her thin dress already soaked through, clinging to her trembling frame. Standing on the trap door, she looked out at the sea of faces. Some she recognized. Others were strangers who had come to witness the spectacle of death. Thomas had been pulled away, his screams now muffled by the hand of an old woman who held him tightly. At least someone was showing him kindness, Eloise thought, trying to find comfort in her final moments. The executioner placed the rough hemp rope around her neck. The coarse fibers scratched against her skin, a preview of the agony to come. She closed her eyes, trying to remember the feeling of summer sun on her face, of her mother's embrace before the fever took her, of anything but this terrible moment. The crowd fell suddenly silent. The only sounds were the persistent rainfall and the nervous shuffling of feet. Eloise opened her eyes, confused by the unexpected hush that had fallen over the square. The executioner's hand still rested on the lever, but he had frozen in place. Then she heard it, the thunderous approach of hooves against stone. The crowd parted like a human sea, revealing a magnificent white stallion carrying a figure draped in royal regalia. King Frederick had arrived. The monarch's presence at a common execution was unprecedented. He sat tall upon his horse, his face a mask of austere authority. Rain dripped from his golden crown, yet he showed no discomfort, no acknowledgement of the elements that soaked his expensive garments. With deliberate slowness, the king dismounted. His boots landed heavily in the mud as he approached the gallows. The crowd held their collective breath. Even the rain seemed to fall more softly in deference to the royal presence. Frederick's eyes met Eloise's. For the briefest moment, something passed between them. Recognition? Compassion? She couldn't be sure. His expression remained inscrutable, giving away nothing of his thoughts or intentions. Then, with a single raised hand, he spoke the words that would change everything. "Stop. She will not die today." A murmur rippled through the crowd, growing louder with each passing second. The clerics, who had been watching with smug satisfaction from beneath the shelter of the castle entrance, stepped forward in protest. "Your Majesty," the high priest's voice rang out, "this woman has committed sacrilege against the crown and church, the sacred chalice." Silence. The king's command was not shouted, yet it carried the weight of absolute authority. "I have made my decision." The executioner hesitated, his hand still on the lever, caught between the clergy's wishes and the king's direct order. Frederick fixed him with a stare that brooked no argument. The hooded man stepped away from the lever, bowing deeply. "Remove the rope," Frederick ordered. A guard scrambled to obey, carefully lifting the noose from around Eloise's neck. She gasped as if taking her first true breath since her arrest. The clerics huddled together, their whispers urgent and angry. The nobles on the balconies leaned forward, suddenly finding this execution far more interesting than they had anticipated. "Take her to the castle," the king commanded, addressing the captain of his guard. Then, without explanation, without addressing the crowd or offering any justification for this extraordinary intervention, King Frederick turned his back and began walking toward his horse. Eloise, still trembling and disoriented, was led down from the gallows by guards who now handled her with unexpected care. As she passed through the crowd, she caught glimpses of faces transformed by confusion, curiosity, and in some cases, resentment. That night, as Eloise was led through the torchlit corridors of the castle, the gallows stood empty in the rain-soaked square. But within the stone walls of the royal residence, rumors spread like wildfire through every hall and chamber. Why would the king save a peasant girl? A handmaiden whispered to a cook. Perhaps she's his bastard daughter, suggested a stable-boy to a guard. I heard she's a spy from the northern kingdoms, a lady-in-waiting confided to her mistress. Maybe she's his lover, snickered a young squire, before being silenced by an older knight's stern glare. As dawn approached, the scandal only intensified. The sacred chalice, the very object Eloise had been accused of stealing, mysteriously reappeared. Not in the church, not in some hidden peasant hovel, but in the private chambers of Crown Prince Edric, the king's own son and heir. A new silence fell over the kingdom, the tense, dangerous quiet that precedes a storm. And as this silence spread, King Frederick issued a single unwavering command. No one speaks of this. No one. Eloise awoke the following morning in a bed softer than anything she had ever known. The morning light filtered through silk curtains, illuminating unfamiliar surroundings of luxury and wealth. As she shifted, she felt a strange stiffness in her clothes. Looking down, she saw dark, rusty stains on her simple dress, dried blood that she had no memory of shedding. Her fingers traced the marks with growing alarm. What had happened during the night? Whose blood was this? And why couldn't she remember anything after being brought to the castle? Eloise blinked awake to the unfamiliar sensation of softness beneath her body. For 23 years, she had known only straw mattresses and rough blankets in the tiny cottage she shared with Thomas. Now, her fingers traced the intricate patterns of golden thread woven through silk sheets that smelled of lavender and sunshine. The tapestries adorning the stone walls depicted hunting scenes and royal processions in vibrant colors she had never imagined possible. Sunlight streamed through leaded glass windows, casting prisms of light across the polished oak floor. Her head throbbed as she sat up, memories of the previous day flooding back in fragments. The crowd's hatred, the rope's bite against her neck, the king's unexpected intervention. But after being led into the castle, everything became a haze. She touched her dress again, feeling the stiff patches where blood had dried. Whose blood? She examined her body but found no wounds. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. The door opened to reveal a young servant girl carrying a silver tray laden with freshly baked bread, a small crock of honey, and a goblet of deep red wine. "Good morning, miss," the girl said, her eyes carefully avoiding Eloise's. "I've brought your breakfast." "Thank you," Eloise responded, her voice still raw from yesterday's terror. "Please, can you tell me why I'm here? What does the king want with me?" The servant set down the tray on a small table near the bed. "I'm not permitted to speak of such matters, miss." Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the food. "I'm just to make sure you eat and have what you need." "My brother," Eloise said urgently, grabbing the girl's wrist. "Thomas. He's alone in the village. He's just a child." "I know nothing of any brother," the servant replied, gently but firmly removing her hand from Eloise's grasp. "Please eat. The bread is still warm." Left alone again, Eloise approached the window. The square where she had nearly died was visible below. The gallows still stood, an ominous reminder of how close she had come to death. People moved about their daily business, occasionally glancing up at the castle as if searching for answers to the previous day's drama. She tore a piece of bread and brought it to her lips. The texture was unlike anything she had tasted, soft inside with a perfectly crisp crust. The wine was sweet and rich, nothing like the watered-down ale served in village taverns. These were luxuries she had never imagined experiencing, yet she found no joy in them. Every bite felt like a betrayal of Thomas, who was likely hungry and terrified. As morning turned to afternoon, Eloise paced the chamber like a caged animal. Occasionally she heard hushed voices outside her door, fragments of conversations that ceased whenever anyone approached. The castle was alive with whispers, and she sensed they were about her. A new sound caught her attention, raised voices from the corridor. She pressed her ear against the heavy wooden door. "She doesn't belong here," a woman's voice hissed. "A filthy peasant walking the same halls as nobility? It's an insult to every ancient family in the kingdom." "The king has his reasons," a man responded in measured tones. "Reasons?" the woman scoffed. "Perhaps the same reasons that put that chalice in Prince Edric's chambers. This reeks of a scheme to hide something more sinister." Their footsteps faded, leaving Eloise with a chill that had nothing to do with the castle's stone walls. The castle was divided. That much was clear. Some viewed her presence as a disgrace, others as a distraction from a greater scandal. She was a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand. As evening approached, a different servant delivered a simple dinner and fresh clothing, a dress of blue linen, finer than anything she'd owned but plainer than what court ladies wore. With the dress came a note sealed with the royal crest. "You must remain here, in silence, for your safety." The king's words offered no explanation, only a command wrapped in the pretense of protection. Was she guest or prisoner? The gilded furnishings suggested the former. The locked door confirmed the latter. Night fell, bringing with it the distant sounds of a castle preparing for sleep. Servants' footsteps, doors closing, guards changing shifts. Eloise changed into the new dress, hiding her blood-stained clothes beneath the bed. Whatever had happened, she needed to preserve the evidence. From somewhere in the castle came the sound of raised voices, followed by a door slamming. The disturbance seemed to center around another wing of the massive structure. Later, she would learn that Prince Edric had refused to leave his chambers since the chalice had been discovered there. The prince was only 17, barely a man. Rumors among the servants suggested he had been found disoriented that morning, his speech slurred, his memories of the previous night fragmented. Some whispered of poison or sleeping drafts, Others spoke in hushed tones of darker possibilities. But the question that haunted the castle corridors remained unanswered. Who had placed the sacred chalice in the prince's room, and why? On her third day in the castle, Eloise ventured into the corridor when a servant forgot to lock her door after delivering breakfast. She walked cautiously, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. The castle was a labyrinth of hallways and chambers, each more opulent than the last. As she turned a corner, she nearly collided with two handmaidens who fell silent at the sight of her. "Good morning," Eloise offered with a tentative smile. The women exchanged glances before nodding stiffly and hurrying past. As they retreated, one whispered to the other, "That's her, the one they're all talking about." Throughout the day, she noticed how conversation stopped when she entered a room, how servants averted their eyes, how guards stiffened at their posts. She was the castle's ghost, present but unacknowledged, the subject of gossip but never addressed directly. That evening, as she sat by the window watching the sunset paint the kingdom in hues of gold and crimson, she heard shuffling outside her door. Expecting another meal delivery, she was surprised when no knock came. Instead, a thin piece of parchment slipped beneath the door. Eloise retrieved it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was hurried, the ink still glistening in the fading light. "They know who you are. Run." The note bore no signature, no clue as to its author's identity or intentions. Eloise read it repeatedly, searching for meaning in the 7 simple words. Who were they? What did they supposedly know about her? And run where? The castle was surrounded by guards. The village offered no sanctuary now that she'd been marked by royal attention. As night settled over the kingdom, Eloise sat on the edge of the luxurious bed, the warning clutched in her hand. Beyond her window, stars emerged in the velvet sky, the same stars that had watched over her simple life in the village, a life now as distant as those celestial lights. In the silence of her gilded cage, one conversation from earlier that day returned to her with chilling clarity. As she had passed an alcove where 2 nobles spoke in hushed tones, she'd caught fragments of their exchange. "If she speaks, the king will fall." The words had thundered through her like summer lightning. Was she victim or weapon in this royal intrigue? Had the king saved her from death, only to use her as a shield against some greater threat? The mystery of the blood on her dress, the chalice in the prince's chamber, the anonymous warning, all pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet assemble. Sleep eluded her that night as questions multiplied in her mind. By dawn, only one certainty remained. Within these walls of privilege and power, truth was the most dangerous currency of all. Dawn broke over the castle walls, painting the stone battlements in hues of amber and gold. Eloise stood by her chamber window, the mysterious note still clutched in her hand. "They know who you are. Run." The words had haunted her through the sleepless night, yet something deeper than fear kept her rooted in place. If she fled now, she might never discover the truth about the king's intervention, about the blood on her dress, about her own identity. With newfound resolve, she tucked the note beneath her mattress and straightened her shoulders. Running had never solved anything in her life. When drought came, when her parents died, when Thomas fell ill last winter, each time she had faced the challenge head-on. This golden prison would be no different. By mid-morning, Eloise had made her decision. She summoned a servant, a nervous young man who nearly dropped his water pitcher when she spoke. "I need to see the king," she said firmly. "Today." The servant's eyes widened. I cannot summon his majesty." "I'm just a—" "Then find someone who can," Eloise interrupted, channeling a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Tell them it's urgent." Hours passed with no response. Eloise paced her chamber, rehearsing what she would say when, if, the king appeared. But when the door finally opened, it wasn't Frederick who entered. Instead, a slender young man with troubled eyes stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 guards who remained outside. Prince Edric looked nothing like the regal heir she had glimpsed from afar at village festivals. His face was ashen, his posture rigid with tension. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly at his sides. The discovery of the chalice had clearly affected him deeply. "Leave us," he commanded the guards, who hesitated before closing the door. When they were alone, Edric's composure fractured. He took 3 rapid steps toward Eloise, stopping just short of grabbing her shoulders. "What did you do to my father?" His voice cracked with strain, hovering between anger and fear. "Why is he protecting you?" Eloise met his gaze steadily. "I've done nothing, Your Highness. I don't understand why I'm here any more than you do." "Lies," Edric spat, turning away to pace the room like a caged wolf. "First, you're sentenced to die for stealing the sacred chalice. Then my father, the king who hasn't shown mercy in 15 years, suddenly rides into the square to save you personally. And then—" He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Then the chalice appears in my chambers, as if by dark magic." "I didn't steal it," Eloise said quietly. "I've never even seen it except from a distance during holy days." Edric studied her face, searching for deception. Whatever he saw there made him falter. After a long moment, he reached into his doublet and withdrew a small iron key, which he placed on the table between them. "The door to the library's back chamber," he said. "Open it tonight when the castle sleeps. The answers you seek may be there." Before she could question him further, he added, "I don't know if you're victim or villain in this game, but I will discover the truth. About you, about my father, about all of it." With that, he strode to the door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "My father hasn't left his council chamber in 2 days. Whatever hold you have on him, know this: a king's favor is as dangerous as his wrath." After he departed, Eloise examined the key, small, ancient, its teeth worn with age. What answers waited in the library? And why would the prince, who clearly distrusted her, provide the means to find them? As darkness fell, Eloise slipped the key into the pocket of her borrowed dress. She waited, counting the bells that marked the passing hours, until the castle's rhythm slowed and midnight approached. When the corridor outside her chamber grew silent, she tested the door and found it unlocked. Another of the prince's arrangements, perhaps. The castle at night was a maze of shadows and whispers. Eloise moved cautiously, pressing herself against walls when guards passed, ducking behind tapestries when servants appeared with late-night errands. She had gleaned enough from overheard conversations to locate the library, a vast chamber in the eastern wing, rarely used by anyone but the royal scholars. The main doors were locked, but a servant's passage led to a smaller entrance. The iron key turned with a protesting groan, revealing a cavernous room filled with the musty scent of parchment and leather. Moonlight filtered through high windows, illuminating towering shelves and reading tables covered in maps and manuscripts. At the far end, partially hidden behind a faded tapestry depicting the kingdom's founding, stood another door, smaller, older, its wood darkened with age. The key fit perfectly, turning with surprising ease, as if the lock had been recently oiled. The back chamber was tiny compared to the main library, but its contents were far more precious. Glass-fronted cabinets held ancient texts and relics of the kingdom's past. A single reading table stood in the center, upon which rested a leather folio sealed with wax that had been recently broken. Eloise's hands trembled as she opened the folio. Inside lay a single piece of parchment, a letter written in a flowing feminine hand. The royal seal at the bottom was cracked, and the date at the top marked it as written 17 years ago. Her heart pounded as she began to read. "My dearest friend," the letter began, "I write with news that brings both joy and sorrow. A child has been born of our forbidden union, a daughter with her father's eyes and her mother's spirit. She will never know the castle as her home, nor wear a crown upon her head, but she carries royal blood nonetheless." Eloise sank into the chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The letter continued, describing the arrangements made to hide the child away with a trusted family in a village far from court intrigue. Names had been carefully omitted or scratched out, but the implication was clear. A king had fathered a child with a woman who was not his queen. Was this why Frederick had saved her? Did he believe she was this child, his child, returned to him by fate? The possibility made her stomach twist into knots. She had grown up believing her parents were simple farmers who died of fever when she was 7. Could her entire life have been built on carefully constructed lies? As she reread the letter, searching for concrete answers among the deliberate omissions, the scrape of a boot against stone froze her in place. She was not alone. The tapestry covering the chamber's entrance shifted, and a hooded figure stepped into the moonlight. Eloise scrambled to her feet, knocking over the chair in her haste. "Who's there?" she demanded, backing away until she felt the edge of a bookshelf against her spine. The figure slowly closed the door, sealing them both in the cramped space. "You should have heeded my warning," a male voice said softly. "Some secrets are better left buried." With deliberate movements, the intruder blocked the only exit. "If you continue digging, it won't be just you who dies." Something about the voice tugged at Eloise's memory, its cadence, its slight accent. Not the refined tones of nobility, but not the rough dialect of peasants either. A servant, perhaps, or a tradesman who frequented the castle. "Who are you?" she asked again, her mind racing to place the familiar voice. The hooded man ignored her question. "Leave the castle tomorrow. Return to your village. Forget everything you've seen here." "I can't," Eloise replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "The king himself ordered me to stay." "Kings can be defied," the man said. "They can also fall. Choose carefully which outcome you prefer." Before she could respond, he slipped back through the door, leaving her alone with the mysterious letter and more questions than answers. As Eloise carefully returned the letter to its folio, her eye caught on something else. A small compartment built into the bookshelf, partially hidden behind a row of leather-bound volumes. Curiosity overcoming caution, she slid the books aside and found a simple wooden box with no lock. Inside, cushioned on faded velvet, lay a silver reliquary pendant bearing the royal crest, a wolf howling beneath a crown. With trembling fingers, she opened the tiny clasp. Nestled within was a single strand of hair, dark auburn with a distinctive copper sheen when caught in the moonlight. Eloise reached up to touch her own hair, the exact same shade. The same distinctive copper highlights that had always set her apart in a village of mostly darker coloring. The pendant slipped from her suddenly numb fingers, landing on the table with a damning thud. The evidence before her told a story she wasn't sure she wanted to believe. A story that would forever alter her understanding of herself and the dangerous game in which she had unwittingly become a central piece. Morning arrived with a sharp knock on Eloise's chamber door. She startled awake, the reliquary pendant still clutched in her palm where she had fallen asleep holding it. Quickly, she slipped it beneath her pillow as a royal guard entered. "The king requests your presence," he announced with formal detachment. "You are to join him for dinner in his private quarters this evening." After the guard departed, Eloise sat on the edge of her bed, turning this new development over in her mind. After days of isolation, the king had finally summoned her. The timing, so soon after her discovery in the library, could hardly be coincidence. As evening approached, 3 handmaidens arrived bearing a dress of deep forest green with subtle gold embroidery around the collar and sleeves, finer than her borrowed clothes, yet still modest compared to the extravagant fashions of court ladies. One servant arranged her hair while another scrubbed the dirt from beneath her fingernails, remnants of her former life working the fields. "Is this really necessary?" Eloise asked as they fussed over her appearance. The oldest handmaiden, a woman with sharp eyes and graying hair, met her gaze in the mirror. When dining with the king, everything is necessary. Escorted by guards through the labyrinthine corridors, Eloise felt the weight of countless stares. Nobles paused their conversations to watch her pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to undisguised contempt. Ladies whispered behind bejeweled hands. A group of young courtiers openly sneered at her simple gait and the way she awkwardly managed the unfamiliar weight of her formal dress. "The peasant plays at nobility," one nobleman remarked loudly enough for her to hear. "Next, she'll be asking for a crown." Eloise kept her eyes forward, her posture straight, even as shame and anger burned within her. These people knew nothing of her or her struggles. Their mockery was as meaningless as their approval would be. The king's private dining chamber was smaller than she had imagined, though no less opulent. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes adorned the walls, and a fire blazed in a stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the polished wood table set for 2. Candelabras of pure silver held dozens of beeswax candles, their honey scent mingling with the aroma of roasted meats and fresh bread. King Frederick stood as she entered, dismissing the servants with a wave of his hand. Alone with the monarch, Eloise fought the urge to curtsy or bow or flee, uncertain of the proper protocol for a peasant dining with royalty under such mysterious circumstances. The king studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He was older than she remembered from his rare public appearances, with deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. His beard, once dark brown, was now threaded with silver. Yet his gaze remained sharp, assessing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "Please sit," he finally said, gesturing to the chair across from his own. They ate in silence at first, the king watching her as she awkwardly navigated the array of utensils before her. She had never used a fork before coming to the castle, much less the specialized implements for different dishes that nobility took for granted. "You know who your father is?" Frederick asked abruptly, setting down his wine goblet. Eloise hesitated, uncertain whether to reveal her discovery from the previous night. "I was raised by Owen the blacksmith," she answered carefully, "after my parents died of fever when I was 7. "And did this blacksmith ever speak of your origins?" "He said only that my mother entrusted me to him on her deathbed," Eloise replied, watching the king's reaction. "He raised me alongside his son, Thomas, treating me as his own. He died 2 winters ago without telling me more." Frederick's smile was tinged with something like sadness. "Yet you have questions, I imagine." "Many," she admitted, "beginning with why you stopped my execution." The king rose from his chair and moved to stand before the fire, his profile outlined in golden light. "What binds us now is more dangerous than any truth," he said cryptically. Eloise set down her spoon, her appetite gone. "With respect, Your Majesty, I am tired of riddles. I nearly died for a crime I didn't commit. I've been kept in this castle without explanation. I deserve to know why." For a moment, she feared she had overstepped. But rather than anger, the king's face showed something like approval at her boldness. "Indeed you do," he agreed, returning to his seat. "When I saw you at the gallows, I recognized something I thought lost forever. You have her eyes, you see, her exact eyes." "Whose eyes?" Eloise pressed, though she already suspected the answer. "Marian's," he said softly, the name clearly precious to him. "The only woman I ever truly loved." After the meal, as servants cleared away the dishes, Frederick led Eloise to a small antechamber where maps and documents covered a large oak table. When they were alone again, he closed the door and turned to her with newfound gravity. "I don't know with certainty if you are my daughter," he confessed, "but I believe you might be." The words hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor embrace, but a possibility that altered everything. "Marian was not of noble birth," Frederick continued. "She was a physician's daughter, educated beyond most women of her station. We met when she was brought to court to tend my father during his final illness. Our love was—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Impossible. The clergy forbade it. The nobles would never accept a queen of common blood." Eloise listened in stunned silence as the king unraveled a tale of secret meetings, whispered promises, and eventually heartbreaking separation. When she discovered she was with child, we knew the danger was grave. My advisors would have seen the child eliminated. A royal bastard threatens the stability of succession. So I arranged for her to disappear, to give birth far from court, to start anew somewhere safe. "What happened to her?" Eloise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frederick's face darkened. "She vanished. Our plan was that after the birth, once she had recovered, she would send word so I could visit in secret. That word never came. I sent trusted men to find her, but it was as if she had been swallowed by the earth." His hand clenched into a fist. "For years I believed both she and the child were dead. And now?" Eloise prompted when he fell silent. "Now I see a young woman with Marian's eyes and spirit, accused of a theft that makes no sense. The timing was providential. I could not let you die without knowing the truth. But the chalice was a convenient tool," Frederick interjected. "Someone placed it in my son's chambers to create scandal, to weaken my position. The kingdom is restless. Many seek to hasten Edric's ascension to the throne." The implications of his words sank in slowly. "You used my salvation to distract from the greater scandal," Eloise realized aloud. "Perhaps," the king acknowledged, "or perhaps I finally found the courage to correct an old wrong. Either way, we are now bound together in a dangerous dance." He approached her then, his royal composure momentarily giving way to something more human. Vulnerability, perhaps even hope. "I have lived 23 years wondering if my child survived, if she grew to womanhood, if she was happy." Eloise felt tears threatening, though whether from anger at being used as a political pawn or some deeper emotion, she couldn't say. "And if I am not your daughter, if this is all mistaken sentiment, then I have saved an innocent from unjust death," Frederick replied simply, "a worthy act regardless." As their conversation extended into the night, the full complexity of the situation unfolded. The chalice's theft and reappearance had ignited religious fervor among the clergy, who saw it as a sign of divine displeasure with Frederick's rule. The nobles sensed weakness and plotted accordingly. The common people, meanwhile, had begun whispering in taverns and marketplaces, questioning a king who would interrupt an execution without explanation. "Tomorrow, a crowd will gather at the castle gates demanding answers," Frederick said grimly. "The clergy wants your head." "The nobles want my crown for Edric. The people want spectacle and certainty." Dawn was breaking as Eloise returned to her chamber, her mind reeling from revelations and unanswered questions. If she truly was royal by birth, what did that mean for her future? For Thomas, still alone in the village? For the kingdom balanced on the edge of upheaval? She paused at her window, watching the first light touch the gallows where her life had nearly ended, and in another sense, truly begun. In the distance, she could already see people gathering in the square, their voices a low murmur rising toward the castle walls like an incoming tide. And then, the king's final words of the night echoed in her memory. "Tomorrow, I will make an announcement that will either restore peace or plunge us into chaos. You will be judged publicly, Eloise, and may God have mercy on us all." The morning dawned clear and crisp, a mockery of the storm brewing within the castle walls. From her window, Eloise watched as the square below filled with people, merchants abandoning their stalls, craftsmen setting aside their tools, farmers leaving fields untended. They came in waves, their numbers swelling until the cobblestones disappeared beneath a sea of humanity. "It's time," announced a royal guard at her door. Two handmaidens followed, bearing a dress unlike any Eloise had yet worn in the castle. Cut from rich burgundy fabric with subtle gold embroidery, it was neither the plain garb of commoners nor the ostentatious finery of nobility, something deliberately in between, marking her unique and precarious position. As they dressed her, Eloise noticed a small detail that sent shivers down her spine. Near the collar, almost invisible unless one knew to look, was the royal emblem, a wolf beneath a crown, embroidered in thread just slightly darker than the fabric itself. A silent declaration from the king. "What exactly is happening today?" she asked the older handmaiden who was arranging her hair. The woman's hands paused briefly. "A public judgment, miss. The king has ordered a special tribunal in the square." "Am I to be executed after all?" Eloise's voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "That is not for me to say." The handmaiden resumed her work, fingers deftly weaving sections of Eloise's copper auburn hair into an elegant yet simple style. An hour later, flanked by 4 royal guards in ceremonial armor, Eloise descended the castle's main staircase. Courtiers lined the grand hall, their curious gazes following her progress. Some whispered behind jeweled hands, others stared openly with expressions ranging from contempt to pity. "Walk tall," murmured one of the guards, a grizzled man with kind eyes. "Whatever comes, show them your strength." The massive oak doors swung open, revealing the scene that awaited. A wooden platform had been erected in the center of the square, not the crude gallows of her near execution, but a formal tribunal dais with seats for officials. Surrounding it stood hundreds of citizens from every strata of society, nobles in their finery, merchants in quality woolens, peasants in homespun garments, all united in their hunger for answers. At the edge of the crowd, Eloise spotted a familiar face, Thomas, her little brother, standing on tiptoes to see over the adults around him. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and she forced a reassuring smile. The crowd parted as she approached, their whispers creating a wave of sound that rolled across the square. Some reached out to touch her dress as if for luck. Others recoiled as though she carried disease. A woman spat at her feet. A moment later, an old man bowed his head respectfully. The platform stood before the same spot where she had nearly hanged. The irony wasn't lost on Eloise as she climbed the steps, her borrowed slippers silent against the wooden planks. At the center of the dais sat an ornate chair, not quite a throne, but clearly meant for the king. Flanking it were simpler seats for royal advisors and clergy. Directly opposite stood a small wooden dock where the accused would traditionally stand. The crowd fell silent as trumpets announced the royal procession. King Frederick emerged from the castle, his crown catching the morning light. He wore formal regalia, deep blue velvet trimmed with ermine, the great sword of state carried before him. The assembled people bowed or curtsied as protocol demanded. What surprised Eloise was the figure who followed immediately behind the king, Prince Edric, dressed in solemn black velvet, his young face a mask of grim determination. Where the king's expression remained carefully neutral, his son's eyes burned with barely contained emotion. The king took his seat at the center of the dais. Court officials and clergy arranged themselves in their designated positions. But rather than joining his father, Prince Edric strode purposefully to the prosecutor's position. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The prince himself would lead the accusation. "People of Westmere," Frederick's voice carried across the hushed square. "We gather to resolve matters that have caused great uncertainty in our kingdom. Justice will be served in the sight of all." A court herald read the formal charges: theft of the sacred chalice, sacrilege against the church, and, most shockingly, a new accusation: conspiracy against the crown. Eloise's knees nearly buckled beneath her. The penalty for the latter was not mere hanging, but drawing and quartering, a death so horrific that even the most hardened criminals prayed to avoid it. Prince Edric approached the edge of the platform, his eyes locked on Eloise. In that moment, he seemed older than his 17 years, burdened by something beyond his youth. "This woman," he began, his voice clear and cutting, "represents the greatest error this throne has ever concealed." The crowd's murmuring grew louder. King Frederick remained motionless, his face betraying nothing as his son continued. "For too long, secrets have poisoned the foundations of this kingdom. Lies have been told in the name of protecting the crown. But what good is a protected crown if the kingdom beneath it crumbles?" High Priest Aldrich stepped forward, his embroidered robes gleaming with gold thread and precious stones. "We have evidence," he announced, unfurling a parchment, "that on the night the sacred chalice disappeared, this woman, this peasant, was seen in the company of a castle servant named Theon, who has since vanished." "Convenient," someone in the crowd muttered loudly enough to be heard. "This servant had access to the royal chapel," Aldrich continued, shooting a glare toward the heckler. "Together, they committed the sacrilege that has brought divine displeasure upon our kingdom." "That's a lie." Eloise finally broke her silence. "I've never met any Theon. I was in the village that night tending my brother's fever." "Silence," the priest commanded. "You will speak when questioned, not before." The proceedings continued in this manner for over an hour. The clergy presented their evidence, circumstantial at best, fabricated at worst. Noble witnesses claimed to have seen suspicious behavior. Through it all, Prince Edric watched Eloise with an intensity that was impossible to interpret. King Frederick observed in silence, intervening only when the accusations became particularly outlandish. Each time Eloise attempted to defend herself, she was cut short by the priests or nobles. The frustration built within her like pressure in a sealed pot. Finally, after what seemed an eternity of one-sided accusations, the king raised his hand. "The accused will now speak," he declared, silencing the high priest mid-sentence. Eloise stepped forward, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes upon her. In that moment, she made a decision, not calculated, but born of pure instinct and the growing certainty that half-truths would not save her. "People of Westmere," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I did not steal your chalice. I did not conspire against the crown. But I do possess something that some find more threatening than any stolen relic." She reached into the hidden pocket of her dress and withdrew the letter she had taken from the library. The confession of a king's forbidden love. A collective gasp rose from those close enough to recognize the royal seal on the parchment. Prince Edric went rigid, his eyes darting between Eloise and his father. The king himself showed the first crack in his composure, a slight widening of his eyes, the only indication of his surprise. "This letter," Eloise continued, holding it aloft, "speaks of a child born of royal blood but hidden away for her protection. A child who, if she still lives, would be exactly my age." Absolute silence fell over the square, a silence so complete it seemed even the birds had ceased their songs. In that perfect stillness, the sound of the king rising from his seat seemed thunderous. Before Frederick could speak, High Priest Aldrich lunged forward, attempting to snatch the letter from Eloise's hand. "Forgery!" he cried. "Blasphemy and treason!" Prince Edric moved with unexpected swiftness, intercepting the priest. "Let her finish," he commanded, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable authority of his bloodline. Aldrich retreated, but leaned to whisper urgently in Edric's ear. Whatever he said caused the prince's expression to harden further. When Aldrich finished, Edric turned to address the crowd once more. "This woman," he declared, pointing at Eloise, "has forged royal documents to support a claim to the throne. She conspired to place the chalice in my chambers to cast suspicion on the royal family. Her ultimate goal, to create enough chaos to seize power for herself." The crowd erupted, some shouting support for the prince, others defending Eloise, many simply adding to the confusion with questions and exclamations. Guards moved closer to the platform, hands on sword hilts, ready for trouble. "The letter is genuine," Eloise shouted over the din. "Ask the king himself." All eyes turned to Frederick, who stood motionless at the center of the maelstrom. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. His next words would determine not just Eloise's fate, but potentially the future of the kingdom. Before he could speak, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. People scattered, revealing a hooded figure forcing his way toward the platform. Guards moved to intercept him, but he evaded their grasp with unexpected agility. "I am Theon!" the man shouted, throwing back his hood to reveal a face marked by hardship but youthful still. "I am the missing servant, and she," he pointed dramatically at Eloise, "saved my life." The square erupted into chaos as Theon pushed through the crowd toward the platform. Guards converged on him, but King Frederick raised his hand, halting them with a single gesture. The young man's face was gaunt, his clothes travel-worn, but his eyes blazed with determination as he climbed the steps to stand before the tribunal. "Let him speak," the king commanded, his voice cutting through the tumult. Theon bowed deeply, then straightened to face the assembled crowd. "I am the servant they claim conspired with this woman to steal the sacred chalice," he announced, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested. "But I have never met her before this day." High Priest Aldrich surged forward. "Lies. You were seen together on the night of the theft." "By whom?" Theon challenged, turning to face his accuser directly. "Name these witnesses who supposedly saw us together." The priest faltered, eyes darting to several richly dressed nobles in the front row of spectators. Theon's lip curled in a knowing smile. "I thought as much," he said. "No one saw us together because we were never together. I was elsewhere that night, in the private chambers of Lord Devereux." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as all eyes turned to a middle-aged nobleman whose face had drained of color. Lord Devereux, one of the king's most trusted advisors and a married man with 4 children, looked as though he might faint. "This is outrageous," Devereux sputtered. "Guards, remove this liar from the king's sight." "Why did you flee the castle, Theon?" Prince Edric interjected, ignoring Devereux's outburst. "If you're innocent, why disappear?" Theon's shoulders sagged slightly. "Because I was afraid. When the chalice was discovered missing, I knew I would be blamed. Servants always are. And certain, powerful people made it clear I would not survive to stand trial." "Who threatened you?" the king demanded, Theon hesitated, his eyes moving between the nobles, the clergy, and the royal family. "It's not that simple, Your Majesty. The conspiracy runs deeper than you know." Eloise watched this exchange with growing understanding. Theon had been a pawn, just as she was, perhaps even a deliberate scapegoat. Their parallel fates had been orchestrated by those seeking to undermine the king. "Tell us what you know," she said softly, drawing Theon's attention for the first time. Something passed between them, recognition of their shared position as expendable pieces in a larger game. Theon nodded almost imperceptibly. "The chalice was taken to create chaos," he explained, addressing the king directly now. "But not by me, and certainly not by her. It was placed in Prince Edric's chambers to cast suspicion on the heir, to weaken your position, Your Majesty." "By whom?" Frederick demanded, leaning forward. Theon took a deep breath. "By those who believe the time has come for a new reign to begin." An uneasy silence fell over the square as the implications of his words sank in. Theon wasn't just implicating a few conspirators, he was suggesting a coordinated effort to force the king's abdication. "Names," the king commanded, his voice dangerously quiet. "I want names." Theon's hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "I can only speak of what I know for certain. The plot was orchestrated by someone with intimate knowledge of the castle's operations, someone who could move freely without suspicion." He paused, glancing at the assembled nobility, whose expressions ranged from fearful to calculating. Then, with visible effort, he spoke the words that would change everything. "It was the Queen Mother who instructed me to place the chalice in the prince's chambers." The crowd erupted again, this time in sheer disbelief. Queen Mother Eleanor, Frederick's own mother, had been revered throughout the kingdom for decades. In her 70s now, she rarely appeared at public functions, but remained an influential figure at court. Prince Edric staggered back as if physically struck. "My grandmother? Impossible." Theon stood his ground. "I was summoned to her private chambers 3 nights before the theft. She told me the kingdom needed change, that her son had grown weak, that you," he nodded toward Edric, "were ready to rule. She promised me protection and gold if I would help create the circumstance that would force the king to step aside." "Why would you betray your king?" demanded a voice from the crowd. Theon's expression darkened. "I didn't go through with her plan. I refused her. That's why I had to flee. Not because I stole the chalice, but because I knew too much and wouldn't cooperate." "Then who placed the chalice in my son's chambers?" Frederick asked, his composure remarkably intact despite the accusation against his mother. "One of her personal guards, I believe. After I refused, I overheard them making alternate arrangements. I was preparing to warn you when I learned that I was to be silenced, permanently." The king rose to his feet, his face a study in controlled fury. "Guards, bring my mother to answer these charges." A tense silence fell as royal guards departed toward the Queen Mother's tower. Prince Edric appeared shaken, his earlier hostility toward Eloise forgotten as he processed this new betrayal. "How does she fit into this?" Edric asked Theon, gesturing toward Eloise. "She doesn't," Theon replied simply. "From what I gathered during my time in hiding, she was an unexpected complication, a convenient scapegoat who became something more when the king intervened." Eloise stepped forward. "But why frame me specifically? I'm a nobody, just a village girl with no connections to the court." Theon gave her a curious look. "Are you? The whispers among the servants suggest otherwise." Before she could respond, a guard returned at a run, breathless with urgent news. "Your Majesty, the Queen Mother is gone. Her chambers are empty, her personal guards and handmaidens missing as well." Frederick's face hardened. "Search the castle. Search the city. No one leaves the kingdom without my knowledge." As guards dispersed to carry out these orders, Eloise felt the crowd's attention shift. The narrative had changed. She was no longer the central villain, but perhaps another victim in a larger conspiracy. The whispers around the square took on a different tenor, speculation about her true identity growing louder. While the tribunal descended into strategic discussions about the Queen Mother's potential whereabouts, Eloise slipped away from the platform's center. The revelation about Eleanor had temporarily overshadowed her own case. giving her a moment to breathe and think. Her mind raced with questions. Why had the Queen Mother orchestrated such an elaborate plot against her own son? Was it truly just political ambition for her grandson? Or was there something deeper, perhaps connected to the letter about Frederick's illegitimate child? As the nobles argued and the clergy attempted to reassert control over the proceedings, Eloise made a decision. This moment of distraction offered a perfect opportunity to seek more concrete answers. Catching Thomas's eye in the crowd, she gestured subtly toward the castle. He nodded, understanding her intent without words, a bond forged through years of shared hardship. Using the commotion as cover, Eloise slipped back into the castle and hurried toward the library. The guards were focused on searching for the Queen Mother, leaving internal corridors largely unpatrolled. She moved quickly through the familiar passages, her mind fixed on one goal: the hidden compartment behind the tapestry. The library was deserted, silent except for the subtle shifting of ancient parchment in the breeze from an open window. Eloise made her way to the back chamber, relieved to find it unlocked. Inside, she pushed aside the tapestry and located the small wooden panel she had discovered earlier. This time, she examined it more carefully, noting a slight depression that, when pressed, revealed a second, deeper compartment behind the first. Inside lay a small wooden coffer, its lock already broken as if someone had recently accessed its contents. With trembling hands, Eloise lifted the coffer and opened it. Inside was a single document, not a formal proclamation or royal decree, but a personal letter written in a feminine hand she hadn't seen before. Unlike the previous letter, this one was signed with a simple M, presumably Marion, the woman King Frederick had loved. Eloise began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. The letter was a confession, written in haste and clearly meant only for Frederick's eyes. In it, Marion explained why she had disappeared without a trace, why she had never contacted him after the birth of their child. "My beloved, if you read these words, know that I fled not by choice but necessity. Your mother discovered our plan. She came to me the night before my arranged departure with an ultimatum: disappear completely, never to contact you again, or watch our child suffer the consequences. She would have rather seen your bastard dead than risk the scandal. For our daughter's safety, I agreed to her terms. If my daughter reads this one day, she will understand why her father never could acknowledge her publicly." The letter continued, but Eloise's vision blurred with tears. Here was the answer she had sought, confirmation not just of her parentage, but of why she had grown up in obscurity, never knowing her true origins. Queen Mother Eleanor had orchestrated her separation from the king more than 20 years ago, and now, decades later, when Eloise had unknowingly reappeared in the kingdom's narrative, Eleanor had attempted another manipulation to maintain her control over the succession. The pieces were finally falling into place, a puzzle spanning decades, connecting her humble life in the village to the highest echelons of power. Eloise clutched the letter to her chest, its revelations echoing through her like thunder. Outside, the clamor of the tribunal continued, but it seemed distant now, as if belonging to another world entirely. With trembling hands, she refolded the parchment and slipped it into the hidden pocket of her dress. The journey back through the castle corridors felt dreamlike. Guards rushed past her, too focused on their search for the Queen Mother to pay attention to one modestly dressed young woman. Servants huddled in corners, exchanging whispered theories about the day's shocking events. No one stopped her as she made her way to the king's private study, a place she had visited only once before, during their dinner. She knocked softly, half expecting to find the room empty. Instead, the door opened almost immediately to reveal King Frederick himself, his crown set aside, his shoulders bearing the visible weight of the day's revelations. "Eloise," he said simply, stepping back to allow her entry. "I wondered where you had gone." The study was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth despite the mild spring day. Maps lay scattered across a massive oak table, markers indicating possible escape routes the Queen Mother might have taken. Prince Edric stood by the window, his youthful face hardened by betrayal. "I found something," Eloise said without preamble, withdrawing the letter from her pocket. Frederick took it from her outstretched hand, his fingers brushing against hers, a momentary connection between father and daughter, though neither was ready to acknowledge it openly. His eyes moved rapidly across the faded ink, emotions chasing each other across his face. Shock, grief, rage, and finally, a profound sorrow that seemed to age him before her eyes. "My mother," he whispered, sinking into a nearby chair. "All these years." Edric approached cautiously. "Father?" Frederick handed him the letter wordlessly. The prince read it with increasing disbelief, his gaze darting between the parchment and Eloise. "Is this true?" he asked his father. "Is she—" He gestured toward Eloise, unable to complete the question. "Yes," Frederick replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I believe so. Marion disappeared 23 years ago. I searched for her, for them both, but it was as if they had vanished from the earth. Now I understand why." Eloise remained standing, uncertain of her place in this family tableau. She was neither servant nor noble, neither stranger nor acknowledged kin. The silence stretched between them, filled with unasked questions and unspoken truths. "She was afraid I would choose you over the crown," Frederick finally said, addressing Eloise directly. "My mother, I mean. And perhaps she was right to fear that. I loved your mother more than power, more than duty." "What will you do now?" Eloise asked quietly. The king rose and approached the fireplace, staring into the flames as if seeking guidance from their ancient dance. "My mother has fled, taking with her those most loyal to her cause. She will not abandon her ambitions easily. The nobles are divided," Edric added. "Some support me, others fear change. The clergy stands with whoever will grant them greatest influence. And the people—" He glanced toward the window, where the crowd's murmurs still carried from the square below. "The people want stability and justice. They deserve both," Frederick said firmly. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. The captain of the royal guard entered, his expression grave. "Your Majesty, the situation deteriorates. Lord Devereux and his allies are calling for Prince Edric's immediate coronation. The high priest supports their position. A crowd has gathered at the eastern gate demanding answers." Frederick nodded, absorbing this information with the calculated calm of a seasoned ruler. "And what of my mother?" "No sign yet, sire. We believe she may have fled to the northern estates. Riders have been dispatched." After the captain departed, Frederick turned to face Eloise and Edric, his daughter by blood and his son by law, the complicated legacy of his reign standing before him in human form. "The kingdom stands at a crossroads," he said, "and so do we." For the next hour they discussed options, strategies, potential allies and enemies. Edric, despite his earlier suspicion of Eloise, now treated her with cautious respect, even asking her opinion on how the common people might react to different courses of action. As they talked, Eloise observed the subtle similarities between father and son, not in physical appearance, for Edric took after his mother with his fair coloring and lean build, but in mannerisms, in thoughtful pauses, in the way they both weighed each word before speaking. "The people don't want more conflict," she offered when asked. "They've endured poor harvests, increased taxes, and border skirmishes. What they crave is stability and fair treatment." "And what of you?" Frederick asked unexpectedly. "What do you want from all this, Eloise?" The question caught her off guard. No one in power had ever asked what she wanted. Her life had been one of survival, of enduring rather than choosing. "I want justice," she said finally. "Not just for myself, but for everyone who has been used as a pawn in these games of power. I want my brother to grow up in a kingdom where his worth isn't determined by his birth. I don't want a crown or riches or revenge. I want—" She paused, surprised by the simplicity of her deepest desire. "I want the truth to matter." Her words hung in the air, their honest simplicity contrasting sharply with the complex political calculations that had dominated the discussion until now. Edric studied her with newfound interest, while Frederick's eyes shone with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Pride, perhaps, or recognition. The moment was broken by commotion from outside, angry voices, the clatter of weapons. Frederick moved swiftly to the window, Edric at his side. "Devereux's men have armed themselves," the prince reported grimly. "They're gathering supporters in the lower bailey. They mean to force the issue." Frederick said, his voice hardening. They will not wait for legal process or peaceful transition. Eloise joined them at the window, watching as a group of nobles in half-armor directed armed retainers into formation. Ordinary citizens stood in confused clusters, some fleeing the castle grounds, others drawn by morbid curiosity to watch the kingdom fracture before their eyes. This ends now, Frederick declared, turning from the window with sudden resolve. He strode to a cabinet and withdrew a sealed document, breaking the wax with decisive motion. "Father?" Edric questioned, alarmed by the king's expression. "I had this prepared weeks ago, when I first sensed the growing dissent," Frederick explained, unfurling the parchment to reveal an official proclamation. "My mother merely accelerated a process already in motion." He handed the document to Edric, whose eyes widened as he read its contents. "You cannot be serious." "I have never been more certain of anything," Frederick replied. "The kingdom needs renewal, not civil war." As they spoke, Frederick removed his signet ring, the ancient symbol of the royal line, worn by kings for 8 generations. He turned to Eloise, his expression solemn yet somehow unburdened. "I am abdicating the throne," he explained, seeing her confusion, voluntarily stepping aside so that Edric may rule without the taint of conspiracy or forced succession. "But," Eloise began, struggling to comprehend this dramatic turn. "It is the only way to restore peace," Frederick interrupted gently. "If I resist, blood will flow. If I step aside willingly, I deny my enemies their narrative of tyranny and weakness." Edric appeared torn between duty and filial concern. "Where will you go?" "The coastal monastery at first, then perhaps beyond our borders. There are places where a man without a crown may still find purpose." Eloise watched this exchange with growing understanding. The king was sacrificing his position not from weakness, but from wisdom, choosing the kingdom's welfare over his own power. It was perhaps the most truly royal act she had witnessed since entering the castle. As Frederick prepared to make his decision public, he paused before Eloise. Without ceremony, he removed a second ring from his hand, smaller than the royal signet, but crafted of the same ancient gold. This he pressed into her palm, closing her fingers around it. "You don't seek power," he said quietly, "and that is precisely why you deserve to be remembered. This was your mother's ring, given to her with a promise I could not keep. Now it returns to her daughter." The metal was warm against her skin, a tangible connection to a mother she had never known and a father she had only just found. Tears threatened, but Eloise blinked them back, unwilling to show weakness before these men who had accepted her without reservation despite the chaos her appearance had unleashed. "What happens now?" she asked, slipping the ring onto her finger where it fit, as if made for her hand. "Now," Frederick said with the weary smile of a man unburdening himself of a great weight, "we face them together, one last time as king, prince, and—" He faltered, uncertain of the title that should follow. "Daughter," Eloise supplied softly. "Just daughter." 1 year had passed since King Frederick's abdication shook the kingdom to its foundations. Spring had returned to Westmere, painting the countryside in vibrant greens and delicate blossoms that seemed to mirror the cautious renewal spreading throughout the realm. In the village square where Gallows once stood, children now played among newly planted apple trees and flowering shrubs. Eloise sat beneath the largest of these trees, a leather-bound book open on her lap as a dozen children gathered around her in a semicircle. Their faces, some clean and well-fed, others bearing the familiar gauntness of poverty, were united in rapt attention as her voice carried the ancient tale across the afternoon air. "And so the warrior queen removed her crown," she read, her finger tracing the illuminated text, "placing it not upon her son's head, but beside a simple wooden cup. Power is a tool," she told him, "not a treasure. Use it to build, not to break." A small girl with tangled blonde hair raised her hand eagerly. "Miss Eloise, could you teach us those funny letters tomorrow, the ones that look like birds?" Eloise smiled, marking their place with a ribbon. "Yes, Lena. Tomorrow we'll practice our Latin letters." She closed the book gently. "That's enough for today. Remember to practice your reading with your families." As the children dispersed, some running toward the village, others lingering to ask questions about the story. Eloise gathered her teaching materials, books from the royal library that were now hers by royal decree, slates for the children to practice their letters, and small pouches of dried berries she used to reward particularly diligent students. The village had changed in subtle ways since her return. The cottage she had shared with Thomas now boasted a small addition that served as her school 3 days each week. Their vegetable garden had expanded, no longer focused solely on survival but growing herbs and flowers alongside practical crops. And the villagers themselves had changed in how they regarded her, not with the suspicious awe that had greeted her initial return from the castle, but with a respectful familiarity born of shared purpose. Thomas, now 10 years old, approached from the direction of the blacksmith's forge, where he had been apprenticing. His face was smudged with soot, but his smile gleamed bright against it. "Master Corin says I have a gift for metalwork," he announced proudly, falling into step beside her as they walked home. "He let me shape a horseshoe all by myself today." "That's wonderful," Eloise replied, ruffling his hair despite his half-hearted protest that he was too old for such gestures. "Perhaps you inherited that talent from Owen." Though Thomas knew the truth now, that neither of them were Owen the blacksmith's blood children, they still honored his memory as the man who had raised them with whatever limited resources he had possessed. Their conversation continued as they passed through the village center, where construction of a new well was underway, one of many improvement projects initiated under King Edric's reign. Workers nodded respectfully as Eloise passed, no longer the simple peasant girl they had known, yet not quite nobility either. She existed in a unique position, acknowledged privately as the former king's daughter but publicly known only as a special ward of the crown, tasked with bringing education to rural communities. At the edge of the village stood a modest stone structure, recently completed and already drawing visitors from neighboring settlements. It wasn't a church or meeting hall, but a garden house enclosing a central courtyard where a statue stood upon a polished granite base. Eloise paused as they passed, as she often did, to study the statue's smooth, featureless face. The figure was clearly female, draped in simple robes, with one hand extended palm up toward the sky, and the other gesturing toward the ground, connecting heaven and earth. At its base, a bronze plaque bore the inscription, "Here died injustice, and courage was born." No names appeared on the monument, not hers, not Frederick's, not even a date to mark the specific events it commemorated. Yet everyone in the kingdom understood its significance. The faceless figure represented not just Eloise's near execution and unlikely salvation, but the larger transformation that had followed. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" Thomas asked quietly, following her gaze to the statue. "That father, the king, had acknowledged you publicly." Eloise considered the question, touching the simple gold ring she still wore on a leather cord beneath her dress. "No," she answered truthfully. "A crown would have been a cage of a different sort." They continued their walk home in comfortable silence, passing fields where farmers worked the spring soil. Several called out greetings, holding up children who had learned their letters under Eloise's patient instruction. This, she reflected, was influence more meaningful than any court position could have provided. In the distance, the castle's towers gleamed in the afternoon sun, a reminder of the power that flowed through the kingdom like an invisible current. King Edric had proven himself a thoughtful ruler in the year since his coronation, implementing reforms that eased the tax burden on common folk while maintaining peace with neighboring realms. Frederick had not attended his son's coronation. By then he had already departed for the coastal monastery where he had chosen to live in humble contemplation. Eloise received letters from him occasionally, philosophical reflections rather than paternal advice, as if they were still finding their way toward defining their relationship. His last letter had arrived just yesterday, carried by a royal messenger. It contained news she had been both expecting and dreading. The Queen Mother had been found dead in a distant northern province, apparently from natural causes, though rumors suggested otherwise. With her passing, the final threat to the kingdom's stability had dissipated like morning mist. That evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, Eloise sat alone by candlelight, composing her response to Frederick. Her handwriting had improved dramatically through months of daily practice, no longer the uncertain scrawl of someone who had learned letters in secret moments between fieldwork. "The children ask about you," she wrote, choosing honesty over formality. "Not as their former king, but as the man in my stories who chose wisdom over power. Some don't believe such a king could exist. I tell them that the truest strength lies not in holding tightly to power, but in knowing when to release it." She paused, quill hovering above the parchment, then continued, "Thomas thrives at the forge. Perhaps one day he might visit you at the monastery to show you his craftsmanship. As for me, I have found purpose in this in-between existence, neither peasant nor royal, but something uniquely my own." The following morning brought unexpected visitors to her small school beneath the apple tree. Royal guards, polished and formal, escorted a familiar figure whose crown had been replaced by simpler attire befitting a king who walked among his people. Edric had changed over the past year, his youthful features maturing into a more thoughtful countenance. The children, initially cowed by his presence, soon resumed their lessons at his insistence, though they snuck glances at him throughout Eloise's reading. "You've created something remarkable here," he observed when the lesson concluded and the children had been dismissed early as a special treat. "They're quick learners," Eloise replied, gathering her books. "Knowledge should never be hoarded behind castle walls." Edric nodded, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My father says much the same in his letters. It seems wisdom runs in the family." They walked together toward the garden house, trailed at a discreet distance by his guards. Villagers bowed or curtsied as they passed, but Edric acknowledged each with the same respectful nod, regardless of their station. "I've received petitions," he said as they reached the statue, "to establish schools like yours throughout the kingdom. Would you consider training others to teach as you do?" The request was unexpected but not unwelcome. "I would be honored," she replied, "though I'm hardly an expert." "You understand what these children need better than any court tutor," Edric countered. "You know their lives, their challenges. That knowledge is more valuable than any academic credential." As they stood before the faceless statue, Eloise realized that her journey had come full circle. From the condemned peasant girl with the noose around her neck to teacher, and now, perhaps, something more. A bridge between worlds that had previously existed in isolation from one another. A young girl approached them hesitantly, clutching a small book to her chest. "Miss Eloise," she asked, glancing nervously at Edric, "is this story real? The one about the king and the peasant girl?" Eloise exchanged a look with Edric, whose eyes held a spark of amusement and something deeper, shared understanding of a truth larger than either of them. She knelt to meet the child at eye level, taking the book gently. "What is real," she said, choosing her words carefully, "is what changes people's lives." The girl considered this answer with solemn concentration before nodding and skipping away, satisfied by a truth she wouldn't fully comprehend until years later. Above them, the castle continued its silent watch over the kingdom. Beyond the forest, the monastery where Frederick had found his peace stood against the coastal winds. And here, in this small village square where death had nearly claimed her, Eloise had discovered a different kind of legacy, not written in royal proclamations or carved on throne room walls, but etched into the minds of children who would carry knowledge forward like torchbearers into the future. What would you have done if you discovered your entire life was built on secrets? If the noose that nearly took your life became the very thing that revealed your true identity? Eloise's journey reminds us that sometimes our greatest strength comes not from power or position, but from the courage to embrace truth, even when that truth shatters everything we thought we knew about ourselves. In a world where bloodlines and birthrights determine destinies, Eloise chose a different path. She found power not in a crown or royal title, but in knowledge shared freely with those who needed it most. King Frederick discovered that true leadership sometimes means letting go, while Prince Edric learned that a kingdom's strength lies not in its castle walls, but in the hearts and minds of its people. What legacy would you choose to build if given the chance to rewrite your story? If this tale of sacrifice, discovery, and redemption touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who appreciates stories of courage against impossible odds. Subscribe to follow more tales that remind us how ordinary lives can become extraordinary when faced with extraordinary circumstances. Remember, just as Eloise told the young girl at the statue, what is real is what changes people's lives.